Welcome, everyone. Welcome. We're glad to have you joining us this Tuesday afternoon or on whatever day of the week it is when you watch this recording. We are so pleased to have you with us. My name is Joe Swimmer. I'm the Executive Director of Episcopal Parish Network, and pleased to greet you and welcome you today to this session on personnel manuals. Thrilled to have this panel of experts, clergy, and lay who can help us work through the importance of personnel manuals, what you need to think about as you're putting those personnel manuals together, maybe a few stories along the way of things that have happened. We're asking you to put your name and where you're dialing in from into the chat so that our folks will know where you are and who's attending. Remember, this session is being recorded and it will be posted, sent out to everybody who registered, posted to our website likely tomorrow. We encourage you to share it broadly in your networks. Also, we have our annual conference, 41st annual conference, upcoming March 3rd through 6th in Charlotte next year. Hope that you will join us. I'm pleased that to tell you that we have confirmed Bishop Sean, presiding bishop, will be returning and with us next year for our opening keynote with Jonathan Rausch. You'll see more about that soon. And then tomorrow, we have another webinar on planned giving. So if you just can't get enough of webinars with excellent content and wonderful panelists, please do join us tomorrow at 3 o'clock. You can learn more about that and all of our upcoming content at our website, episcopalparishes.org. If you're not a member, please consider joining us. It helps us to support this good work. So without any further ado from me, I thank Stephen, John, and Jim, our moderator, for joining us today. And I'm going to hand it off to Jim to lead us through the discussion. Jim?
Thank you very much, Joe. Welcome, everybody. We have a great hour for you. I know it's not enough time to talk about HR manuals, but hopefully we'll get some good content in for you. And again, put your questions in the chat and your name and where you're from. That would help us out a lot. I'd like to introduce, first of all, the three presenters for this topic. John Crow is a parishioner here at St. David's. And I should first introduce myself. My name is Jim Lamm. I'm the parish administrator at St. David's in Austin, Texas. And I have an MBA and been certified as an senior HR professional. So let me introduce John Crow. He is a longtime HR professional in industry in Charles Schwab and other banking and other industries. He is also a parishioner here at St. David's and our current senior warden. So John, thank you very much and welcome. Our next presenter is Stephen Balke. He is the canon vicar at St. James Cathedral in Chicago, and he has some roots here in Texas, so we're happy to have him for sure. And our next presenter is John Roars. He is the rector at St. Stephen's in Richmond, North Carolina. So we're very thankful and privileged to have the three of you to discuss this wonderful topic with us. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to John Crow and let him talk to you all about it. And again, put your questions in the chat. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jim, and welcome everyone. We're so glad you were able to join us today. I know from my history, sometimes when you see an HR manual panel discussion, you go, oh, wow, this could be really dry, or it could be fun. So we're going to try to keep it fun and engaging with you today. A little bit about me, Jim. Jim did give a brief bio. I've been in HR for about 30 years. I hate to say that. And have held pretty much every type of role you could have in HR. I've been a senior business partner to CEOs and CIOs and CTOs. I've spent many years in HR operations, payroll, putting together shared services. I think the most relevant thing, though, I would say, is that I spent time when I was at Charles Schwab for 13 years. I spent time as the head of the HR policy function at Charles Schwab. So you got this nice mix of both business, but also the impact of financial services. And I'll just add too, I'm going to kind of set scope for you all. I see you all are basically joining us from all over. So I think the important thing to think about when you think about HR manuals is actually what state and what city you're living in, because that actually informs some of the legal aspects of it. But let me start high level, just saying kind of why I think a an HR manual is important. And I'm calling it an HR manual, not necessarily, it's called policy and procedure sometimes, but I think the thing that's most overlooked is the fact that it's a communication vehicle. And it communicates who you are as an organization to the values and the mission of who you are as an organization to your employees, to your managers, and then ultimately as that's translated into employment practices to your applicants. And so grounding, I think I've learned through my experience, one of the most important things you want to do is you want to have your HR policy document match who you are. Otherwise, you get this juxtaposition of, we have these rules, but that's not really who we are, which can cause problems for you. So I see it as a communication document first and foremost. And the big benefit of it, that is that it's for both employees and managers at the same time. So everyone is operating off the same playbook. They know what the same kind of policies or procedures, the way things that are going to play out. And it also speaks to how the organization actually will implement those things. Then secondly, I would say it's an operational document. It basically says how you're going to run and operate your people function, if you will, or your how are you going to interact with your employees, and what benefits are you going to provide them, how you're going to get paid, all those many things that that are really, really important to people. And the good thing about documenting it is that and having it documented is number one, you don't have to have this thousands of questions. So now, what day do we get paid, or how are my taxes calculated, or and then I think the worst of that is when you get, well, Sue told me that they were calculated this way, so you start having this telephone game. So it's this operational manual that talks about how you're going to run things related to the people function. The really important part of it, and this gets into like where I'm going to talk about the legal aspects of it, but it should clearly articulate and outline what are the terms and conditions of your employment. And that includes everything from your benefits to your pay to that you're an employer at will. And it's real important to have that language in there and have it spelled out. It's also going to cover like how you get a job there for applicants, how you get promoted, all those different types of things that would govern your terms and conditions of employment. And then probably the most unpopular thing is that it needs to cover how your employment would separate or what would separate your employment. So you're going to want to have a business conduct policy, for example. You're going to want to have or code of conduct. I think that's probably more important for our setting here. But just all of these terms and conditions that that are both good and bad, if you will, as an outcome. And then finally, it's a legal document, and it is what you would use and what you will use. Knock on wood, hopefully many of you haven't had this, but if there's employee litigation, so it's going to defend your decisions. You're going to be able to point to it as a document that says, this is how we operate. This governs our management decisions within the scope of our people practices. The caveat to that is that only works if you keep it updated. Mm-hmm. And updating it is part of what I would broader call an HR audit. So for those of you that are in the administration function, you might think about, have I done an HR audit recently? Is my policy manual up to date, or is the manual up to date? Or am I looking at pay equity? Those are all things out of the scope of today. But I think that is the bigger picture, and then looking at your HR manual as one part of that.
Hey, John.
So you've got it. Yes.
Just a real quick question that's on what you're talking about. Why does it need to say how we hire, given the applicant won't see the doc until they are employed?
It needs to say how you're hired because it outlines your application process or and it says it internally. So and traditionally, that same practice that you use for externals, other than where you post for the job, is going to also include your internal transfers. So you want to align your employment practices or application practices, whatever you want to call it. It's about how you get into the organization or how you get into a role.
Yeah, I
So,
would just, yeah, exactly, John. I just also add that it also, if you don't hire somebody and they come back and, sue you because you didn't hire them, you have a say, nope, we went through these steps. Basically, you can say to a judge, we went through these steps. That's, we do that for every single person. They may not be able to claim discrimination or something like that as easily if you have that set plan. Sorry, go ahead, John.
and if you have a discrimination policy,
Right.
right? So and what I found in the harassment and discrimination policy in the church world. uh, Jim kept me busy. When I actually got laid off from Schwab 2 years ago, and I did a lot of one of the things he had me do was work on St. David's HR manual. So I got some church experience on top of that as well. So and the way that you would manage reporting, right, of a harassment claim or is very, very different in how it's documented and how it's reported and the level of which it is done inside a church than maybe it is inside of a small company. And so that was one thing I noticed. But you definitely want to have, if you have it regarding clergy and regarding, how you report an incident with clergy, but you don't have it about how you would do that between employees, or if a parishioner, for example, engaged with an employee that wasn't a parishioner. You want to have all those things covered in some type of harassment and discrimination policy with your clergy, and your diocesan policy usually kind of fitting in with that. I know my clergy friends will talk a lot more about, the difference between the private sector and then also operating in a church, because it was very, very, very informative for me, that work we did, Jim, and that I came at it strictly from a business perspective, and Jim was like, well, you got to think about it this way.
Good.
So that's kind of everything I have kind of as an overview. And now, who am I passing it off to? Who's going next?
Stephen, if you want to take the helm and introduce yourself more fully than I did, and then we'll proceed from there. Thanks, John Crow.
Great, thank you. Yes, yep, I am Stephen Balke. I'm the canon vicar at St. James Cathedral in Chicago. Certainly come at this from the experience of having worked on, John, as you were pointing out, personnel manuals and HR concerns pre-church life, and then having made that shift over to doing personnel management in the church side of things and seeing where that's different. And then also just as the needs of the church continually evolve and change, I would say it's fair to say there are things that we have to consider for personnel management and personnel manuals in 2025 that we weren't thinking about in 1995, that we weren't thinking about in 2005. And that gets to a couple of things. One is, as John mentioned, it's very important to consider state and local regulations as that pertains to personnel management. We have the added wrinkle in the church of having to consider things like church canons, both national and diocesan church canons, which if you're a clergy person and you've moved from one diocese to another diocese, those rules will be different from place to place, especially when it comes to things like social media policies or nepotism policies come to mind, where in some dioceses, for example, a member of the vestry can be married to a member of the staff, whereas in other dioceses that's going to be against the canons of the church to do that. So you'll want to make sure you're familiar, if you shift from not just one state to another, but from one diocese to another, how those policies can be different. Then adding on top of that, the element of our churches are constantly changing. Ultimately, it's a church. It's made up of the members, the constituent members that are changing, which means your focus as a community, your mission statement as a community is going to change. And if you're not constantly taking a look at your personnel management, your personnel manual from the perspective of is this still a guiding document that is consistent with who we are as, Saint X in 2025, or are we still operating off of the manual that the vestry wrote 40 years ago? I did come in to a church. We won't name names. I guess I'll come into a church at one time where we still could call emergency meetings for our personnel by telephone or telegraph only, and we obviously we needed to increase, create a provision for saying, we can email them. That's okay. It's not the end of the world, but what it did point to was that we hadn't made sure that for the past few decades that our guiding document was really consistent with the vision of who we are and who we're called to be in the surrounding community today. And so those are things you want to make sure you look at from the church perspective. And then I think another big thing for me that I've learned over my experience in this is just that, try as you might, you can't use the manual from the perspective of preventing any form of conflict. You can't legislate your way out of having to deal with communications and conflict resolutions. At its best, what it should be able to do is be a guiding document that's going to help you navigate those conflicts when they arise, rather than trying to prevent them from happening. When I bring some of the perspective from actual pre-marriage counseling work, when I'm doing pre-marriage counseling work, I always recommend to the spouses to be that they go out and they get a copy of, say, Emily Post etiquette manual. And it's not necessarily because you have to do it the way that Emily Post said, but when there's a conflict, you do want to have some document that you can turn to that's a neutral source to be able to say, here's the guidance that's written down. This will help us navigate the situation we find ourselves in. In an ideal world, I think our good personnel manuals should be able to do the same thing, that when we found ourselves steering into the direction of an unforeseen conflict, we should be able to sit down with it together, and not for the perspective of finding out who was right and who was wrong, but from the perspective of this document should help us remember where our core values are and how we can resolve that conflict by being consistent with those values. I think
Good.
I'd like
Thanks,
to
John.
on.
Thanks, Stephen.
Stephen, I'm going to add a point to that, because I think you brought up a very important talking about the conflict, right? And how sometimes it can be seen as it needs to be a rule book where I'm going to go here and it's going to give me the answer. And it really needs to be a balancing act between guidelines and rules, because if you over rely on it and then someone wants to make an exception, like you say, if you steal, then we're going to fire you. Now, most of the time you probably would say that, and that would be agree. But I've found in my career that the one time you use, always, or you use something like that, then you're going to get a situation where, well, maybe that's not the right decision. So you want to balance that, where you're still giving your managers and your administrators and your clergy even discretion in how they handle that. You don't want to take away discretion, but you want to have this set of guidelines that will help them navigate that and navigate those conflicts.
Very good. Thanks. One of the comments was, generally is a good word for that. I think it is referring to what you had said, John. So
generally, usually,
yeah.
you write in the subjunctive.
Right. Yeah. John Roars, do you have some knowledge you'd like to impart to us as well?
Sure. I have more experience than knowledge. I'm not going to claim any expertise, but I have some lived experience to share. So I'm John Roars. I've been 3 years the rector at St. Stephen's in Richmond, and before that was 13 years a rector in Norfolk, Virginia. And so what I have is just lived ups and downs experience here. What I would say is I really like the way a couple of you have put it in the language of our values. So our mission is to live as a community of hospitality, healing, and hope, sharing the love of Christ here. And so that we think about that mission as it is conveyed or not, but hopefully as it is conveyed in our employee handbook. And we try to think about the handbook or the manual in terms of the expectations that I have, that we have of our employees, and equally so the expectations that they can have of me and of us, the sort of the leadership of the church. And my experience is that employees will pay more attention to it when they see it as a mutual, reflective of a mutual relationship and kind of covenant that goes both ways. And so, as much as we include, disciplinary processes and codes of conduct and all the rest, try to give equal attention to the benefits, to how healthcare works, how vacation works, how, leave policies for medical leave or bereavement leave or what have you. We built into ours how, flex time, if somebody needs to take some study time to work from home, or somebody has some compensatory time when they've been away on a mission trip or whatever, how do all those benefits come into play where we're really saying what we're after is the health and wellness and wholeness of our employees and our whole church system, and how can we convey that through our handbook and kind of help promise as much as we can, help promise our side of that. So that's some of the things that we've tried to work on. I would just echo a few of the sort of putting flags in a few of the things that we've had to pay attention to over my years, and leave policies is one of them. Sort of, we tend to think of that maybe just in terms of childbirth, but adoption policies and leave, or medical leave for a medical chronic medical condition or emergency, caring for a family member, or it's come into play for us in cases of like addiction and substance abuse, and somebody needing to go, like there's a broad spectrum of things that can fall into that, and you want to really think about that full spectrum.
Yeah, John, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. We have a couple of questions that are apropos to kind of what you're saying. One was, can we somebody wants to at some point just touch on remote work policy, because you did mention about working from home. What does that look like now? And kind of a partner question, how can we accurately track hourly personnel who work at home occasionally? Is it smart to allow this? Obviously, COVID has changed all of our outlooks on working from home. We never, in my long career in churches, we've never allowed people to work at home for the most part. If somebody stays home because they have a meeting later or something like that. But now it's almost commonplace, or it was. It's kind of going back to that. But what would you say, John Roars, about that? And others can chime in if they would like. What do you do at your at the enrichment for people that work from home, or do they?
Yeah, I would say it's complicated because there are some people whose presence in the building, in the office, is sort of more essential to carry out their job than others. It's different if you're on the facilities team needing to set up for events than if you can be at home designing a brochure or bulletin or something, right? And so it's tricky to have a policy that applies universally, in my experience. So it's a little bit of a case by case in terms of the type of work and how people can fulfill their ministries. What we do is we have a block of flex time where anybody can have a block to work from home, do some study work or whatever, and that's the universal part. But it's but it's minimal. It's not days long. It's a block of time. Otherwise, we kind of take it case by case.
Right. Stephen, do you have any experience on people working from home at the cathedral?
Sure. Oh, absolutely. And as you pointed out, definitely more so since the pandemic, when partly we realized there were a lot of things that we were doing in person that didn't necessarily have to be done in person. Now, introducing that kind of flexibility does mean I would recommend there needs to be some clarity about expectations and outcomes. We the approach I've tried to make with personnel has been one of it being outcome based. Here are the things that we're expecting to get done, and sometimes if you're able to accomplish the things that need to be done and you're able to do that from home instead of in the office, that's fine as long as the work is getting done. It doesn't matter to me as much where you're doing it. There needs to be some degree of even more clear and careful communication. If someone's not in the room, you're not able to just walk down the hall and talk to somebody. You may want to think through in your policy of if someone's working remotely, they need to be just as reachable as they would be if you needed to be able to walk down the hall and talk to them. Is that the expectation? And if it is, then you need to have some careful thought put into if you're opening the door of, I have the expectation that I'm able to call you whenever and for whatever I need from you. What are the parameters around when are you off and when are you on? Just for the employee's sake as well as my sake, it wouldn't be fair for me to be calling them up at 8 o'clock at night because they're when they're supposed to be off for the day, but they're working from home. So I don't have a clear sense of when they're working and when they're not working. So it means there needs to be a lot more clarity. And the understanding that I think one thing we figured out from the pandemic is we all realized the rules can change. The rules can change quite a bit. And so working with any employee from the standpoint of saying, right now the job works for, say, you're able to do 2 days from home and 2 days in the building. We realize circumstances might change next year and we need you to be 3 days in the building and 1 day at home. And that's got to be a part of the term of the employment, is that flexibility or not, to be aware that everybody's going in with the same understanding of what the conditions are.
Yeah. Just for St. David's here, we had everybody come back into the building in September of 2023. And with the general exceptions, like if you have an appointment in the morning, you can just work from home until you're done, whatever. But one of the other question was hourly employees. We do not let hourly employees work from home. If you do let them, and John Crow, you probably have experience with this it happens more than I think than church. But if you have somebody who's hourly, let's say they do the bulletin on an hourly basis or whatever, most like ADP, Paychecks, all of them have remote on your phone that you can log in when you start working, when you log out, but you really need to keep track hard data of when they're working and when they're not, because what you don't want to have happen is they quit or they get fired and they come back and said, I have 300 hours of overtime that they never paid me and I want the money. And you have no proof that they didn't work it. So John, John Crow, do you have a comments about that or about hourly people working from home? You're muted, John.
Yes, I do have some guidance and actually some stories. So actually, to prepare for this, I actually kind of Googled what are the top 3 reasons HR manuals are changing in 2025. And right at the top of the list was return to office or return to work. And I think that, when the pandemic hit, there was always this perception that you can't be as productive at home as you would be in the office. Well, then when the pandemic hit and we all went home, we found not only were you as productive, in many cases, we got more work out of people. And so then it's like, well, what is the justification to call people back to the office, right? So you had to be able to tell that story. And, ultimately where companies have landed as, we know you can do the job and we know you can be, productive, but what it's about is that walking down the hall. It's that little, it's that social interaction, that ability to network, that ability to grow. And like when I was at Schwab, we actually started bringing people back first 3 days a week. And then we went to that block of time. And then they're ultimately now down to like 4 days a week that you're in the office and one day that you can float. The overtime thing is not to be overlooked. I mean, the Fair Labor Standards Act says that the obligation falls on management to determine if an employee has worked those hours. And so the burden of proof is on the employer to be able to produce records and say, I know this person didn't work these 300 hours. I had actually, when I was employee relations at Schwab, I actually did an investigation where, similar to what Jim was saying, a person was terminated, and then she came back and, of course, filed a claim with the EEOC. But not only did she do that, she filed one with the Fair Labor against the Fair Labor Standards Act and said she had 200 hours of overtime that she hadn't been paid for. And so ultimately, we had not been, they've been very flexible with her and allowing her to work from home. But then ultimately, we ended up having to like settle for some kind of in between versus the 200 hours. So you can do it with non-exempt employees. I just think you need to have additional checks in place where if they're putting their time on the phone in ADP, you're confirming with them some other way that that actually is accurate, and that they did, and to have something in writing that said confirming you did not work any overtime, or you have to ask for approval. You didn't ask for approval, that means you didn't do it. So those types of things, supporting procedures, or what you would need to have in place. But generally, I mean, when I was at Schwab, that's one of the things we changed is we said non-exempt employees cannot do it, and that was difficult. So this is where the culture had changed, and now all of a sudden you're swinging the culture back by a policy, and the managers and the employees and leadership are all trying to keep up and get on board with it. But yet, it's all in flux, and you don't want to make everyone mad, so they quit, and your attrition goes up. But you also know that you've got to take this position.
Yeah, one of the questions in the chat along with that, as you mentioned, things change. They ask, can terms of employment be changed? Hours per week, hourly pay, sick time, and in-office requirements. In the chat, I said yes. I don't think you can take hours away from people. Let's say they've accrued 2 weeks worth of vacation or sick time. You can't say, well, now we're only going to allow you to accrue 1 week, so we're taking a week away unless you pay them for that week. But John, what's your response to that? Can you change employment parameters at any time or terms at any time?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, even if you make a benefits change, right, you're changing the terms and conditions of your employment. And you should say that not only in your HR policy manual, you should say broadly that any of the policies or anything in the manual can be changed at management's discretion, at any time without notice. Those are all the words you want to have in there, is that we're, as a company or as an organization, as a church, we're driving these decisions because we believe that that these are the best way for us to operate, and we can change them should we need to change them. But if you don't spell it out, you didn't do it.
Right. Thank you.
I would jump in there and just note that I think something that has become more common in my experience is the prevalence of part-time church staff, especially as some churches can't afford a full-time person in a given position, and they need to, and so like some of the people I've had where I have revised a letter of agreement have been, shifting from full-time to part-time by their own choice or by the changing choice circumstances in the church or whatever. And so it's important to be clear on how the benefits apply similarly or differently depending on part-time versus full-time staff, salaried staff, and then hourly staff as well. Kind of how do the different categories play into vacation time, healthcare, retirement benefits, and so on. And for all this, one thing maybe nobody has said, but for what it's worth, I'll say is I would encourage nobody to do this on their own. Like at our church, it's been different. In my last church, we had a whole personnel committee, sort of separate from the vestry. At this church, the officers of the vestry, plus the most recent senior warden, form a personnel committee. So it's different in every place, but having that group of people who are thinking through all of this with you, reviewing it with you, handling sticky situations with you is really critical.
And also, I mean, I would add too that I think having a subcommittee, ad hoc personnel subcommittee of the vestry, in many ways can help protect the rector, right, from litigation, in the sense that there is input being provided, and of course, your rector takes input from various places when she makes decisions, but ultimately, there is another point of data, or there were another group of people that looked at it, and then that helps take some of the secrecy of the decision away, but it can be a way to provide some legal protection for your rector.
Good point. Another question in the chat was, where does onboarding and training come in? And how do you do it? Stephen and John Rose, you can chime in as well of how you do it at your churches.
Yeah.
Go
ahead,
Steve. Sorry. One of the things that this does get partly also to my earlier point too about state and local rules, but also diocesan and national church rules as well. You'll want to make sure you're familiar in terms of onboarding any employees. You're going to want to make sure you're familiar with what are the safe church policies, who has to take which modules of the safe church training. If your diocese requires any kind of anti-racism training, lots of those are mandated now, and some will even tell you have to take this many hours of training, or even provide the source where it has to come from. And so even if you are, whether you are at a large church system with a large multi-clergy paid staff with an HR department, or even if you are at a small church with mostly volunteer led leadership, often there are specific rules about the kinds of onboarding that has to be done for church pension group rules, safe church rules, anti-racism training rules, and then even nonprofits often have specific requirements about what safety training in the workplace has to be provided in terms of equipment usage. Considering anybody who's going to be working with children or food, you're probably going to also have some rules around food service rules. Those often get overlooked, but there are usually specific health code rules that have to go with that as well. So you want to make sure that you're familiar with what are the required trainings as part of the onboarding, and then. I know we keep reiterating this, but I think it's because it's worth continuing to make sure we highlight that maybe one of the most important things you can lift up in your training when you're talking about policies and procedures is being able to articulate why the things that are the policies and procedures fit into the vision of this church. So whether it is a maternity leave, paternity leave policy, or work from home policy, any of the members of the clergy, any of the members of that personnel board or your vestry should be able to explain why these things are consistent with the vision of what St. X here we're trying to achieve, so that any employee then when they're looking at their personnel manual, should also be able to, as part of their onboarding, as part of their training, they should be able to look at it and say, I understand how this rule is consistent with the value at this place.
Yeah, good. John Roars, do you have anything to add?
No, I thought that was great. I I was thinking about how if you don't currently have a manual, a handbook at your place, a guy saw in the chat somebody was wanting a sample, and I would think that most dioceses could probably point you to a template, or you could reach out to, some of the other churches in your city, in your region, and, work on it together. I mean, kind of get a group together to think through collaboratively how to put that together. So I was thinking, I mean, it's such a there's so many different aspects to this that we've named, and it's kind of hard to get your head around it. But working on that together and relying on some of the resources in your diocese and your community could really get you started.
Okay, this is maybe a question for clergy, but the question is, are clergy covered by handbooks? Our outside HR expert / lawyer told us that since clergy serve at the discretion of the diocese, they are covered by the letter of agreement, but not a parish handbook. Do either of you know the answer to that question? I thought that since they're, like St. David's, they're employees of the parish, we pay the clergy.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, they're bound by our handbook, but we do have a letter of agreement, but it's with the parish and the clergy, not with the diocese and the clergy. What about your cases?
I mean, but in my, I mean, I've just have hired a new clergy person who's coming on board soon, so this is in my head. And in our case, I think different dioceses do it differently. I know they do. In our case, the bishop's office is involved in working on the letter of agreement when a new clergy person comes on. And yet that letter of agreement is not comprehensive at all. It doesn't cover all of the expectations, benefits, requirements that we have in within our own parish. And so both are true. I think that the letter of agreement, there are certain things that are governed by diocesan policy and practice, but there's a lot more in our handbook that we're also saying we hope and expect this from employees, and this is what we are offering to them in return. And so both are true.
I think that's right. And a couple of things I would add. One is it's important to note canonically, there's also a difference between a rector of a parish versus any clergy non-rector of the parish, that just the canons treat those circumstances differently. It's worth considering. Such as, for an example, if you have an associate rector that's working under the discretion and the employee of the rector of the parish, and the rector of that parish decides they want to terminate the relationship with the associate, that's a different circumstance entirely from the rector isn't doing what we said they need to do in the handbook, therefore we want them fired. Very different circumstance. I would say, I think there is a point to be made of, hopefully, if you're any handbook that is setting out expectations about what the clergy person is expected to do at a parish, hopefully is something that everybody had gone into with the shared understanding of these are the expectations of the role, with the understanding that if there was a problem where a clergy person was in open violation of, say, a policy in the handbook, while the parish wouldn't be able to just terminate that person for failing to meet the requirements of the handbook, that the reason why that would be important to have is because that could be the starting point of any conversation a parish would have with the bishop, with the diocese, about discussing what corrective actions should be taken that could result in severing the relationship. It could result in changing the handbook. It could result in changing behavior. But that would be a conversation that would happen with the diocese, with the bishop. But all the more reason why actually I think a clear set of policies in the handbook would be helpful for framing that conversation.
Good.
And I actually think it's important too, sort of up front, to just point out that there are differences in the terms and conditions of employment between clergy and employees, because sometimes staff coming in, you know, they may not know that, and you'll get, well, why does why does Father Daniel get a sabbatical and I don't? And it's just them understanding that you're operating in this multi-governance structure. And then I think too, I mean, if there's a way to cross-reference stuff as much as possible, that's important as well. But ultimately, the conversation is going to happen with the bishop about anything that the clergy member would do that would need to be looked into or investigated.
Right. Thank you so much. That's very helpful. Another question is, can you talk about parishioners and volunteers? They aren't employees, but we might like them to be aware of some of the policies, e.g. food service, etc. Is there such a thing as a separate volunteer policy doc? And I can just say there can be, and there's nothing saying that you can't have a policy for volunteers, especially when it comes to licensing or city requirements like food handler's license, liquor license for bartenders, or in Texas it's I can't think of the name now, but it's the Department of Alcohol, and they have to be licensed for that.
TABC.
Yeah, it's it, TABC. So those type things. Any of us have experience, or Stephen or John Roars, do you guys have volunteer manuals other than safeguarding?
In our case, I would say what we have is not a fulsome manual that covers all volunteers, but we have particular policies and practice. Like the food is a good example. We'll have like a policies and practices around food service without having a full hand. So it's sort of more segmented. But I can see it doing it either way.
It's a valuable question, especially considering in the church today, there are far fewer churches, say like St. David's Austin, with a dozen plus paid employees on staff in charge of ministry areas. Far more of our Episcopal churches are going to be a single employee clergy person, maybe not even a full-time clergy person, maybe a paid parish administrator. But lots of times the church is run by unpaid lay volunteer leadership. For all intents and purposes, that's personnel. I mean, they're unpaid personnel and they may not have a contract as such. But I think it's all the more important that anybody that's in a leadership role, even if it's a volunteer unpaid leadership role, has an understanding of what are the appropriate procedures. Again, because it's talking about these are the things that will help us maintain the shared mission and vision of this place. You want your unpaid people to be able to support the vision and mission just as much as the paid people.
Right.
I would add, and this is not really it's going to depend on the size of the parish, but just think very strategically around what should stand alone, an expense policy if you're a large organization, food handling, because what ends up happening is if you try to be too all-encompassing, every time you want to change some kind of operational policy, then you're going to find yourself having to rewrite your document. Now that's fine in a smaller group. I mean, some of these can be so simple, right? They may be just 6 or 7 policies, if that. But nothing says it has to be so comprehensive like a very large organization would have.
No, and the other thing you could simply say, like, especially for like people where it's licensing or city ordinance or state ordinance, you could just say we follow all city, state, county policies and regulations for volunteers and staff, something like that, and that may be enough to. That way, if the city changes, you don't have to change your policy. You're just reflecting what the city wants. The other thing somebody asked is more pointed is, who do you have handled checking the voicemail after hours, and how are they compensated? So I didn't think anybody did that anymore, but we have a directory, that people get, and if it's a pastoral call, one of the clergy is on call. They don't get compensated for the calls that they may get. But if you do have somebody checking, I would say, if you do have somebody checking voicemails, at 9 o'clock at night or every hour or whatever it happens to be, you could pay them instead of by the hour, because may only take like 2 minutes or 1 minute to call. Pay them by the call, and there should be a log of all the calls, and you could do it that way. But anybody have experience with that type of thing, where people are basically charged with checking voicemail on a regular basis when office hours, let's say from 6 to 11 o'clock at night?
I mean, there are companies that you can hire to do. I mean, we for a time we had a company that did that. So we paid them whatever it was in the budget each year, and then they would receive the calls and call the clergy person who was on call that day, rather than it going directly to. So that there are such companies.
Yeah, there are. And also, like I said, we have voice over IP system, which is on the internet. So if somebody leaves a message on my work phone, I get an email with the message on it. So in that sense, now again, this is for salaried people, not necessarily hourly. You got to be careful with hourly people, and I'm sure John Crow can talk about this. Hourly people are kind of a different animal when it comes to because you're paying salaried people for the position, not for the hours necessarily. And hourly people, you could get into trouble again with the overtime issue if you're allowing hourly people to do this type of stuff after hours. John Crow, is that correct?
That's very true. And then there's also an aspect of it. I don't want to get too technical, but there's an aspect of the Fair Labor Standards Act that says, is the person waiting to be engaged? So can they not go out to a party or can they not have a beverage, an alcoholic beverage, because someone may call that night that they have to be, or they on call, then you have to pay them on call pay. So if you're going to do this, it's better to have, someone who's salaried do it. And again, it just depends on how large you are. It might just be a list of these are the people that are available, and you call and you call until you get one. But I have also seen those call services. I mean, doctors' offices use those all the time. It provides some privacy for your clergy as far as not having to give out their personal numbers.
Yeah, that's true. Thank you. What about, I don't have any more questions in the chat, so I'm gonna ask some questions prepared for all three of you. How can churches let me start this one. How do you get leadership or clergy buy-in and consistency in applying the policies that you've incorporated into your personnel manual? So you as clergy, how is the best way to get you to have buy-in? Now, you guys are obviously bought in already, but for another clergy person, how is best for especially somebody in my position or a senior warden to get buy-in with the rector or other clergy to actually follow the policies when it comes to employment and hiring and firing and things like that?
I'll just offer one thought is, I think making it a mutual and living document, like we talked about, reflecting your mission, all those things are kind of most important. Another thing that we've tried to emphasize a lot lately here is living out those sort of expectations and promises that we make to each other in the context of your ministry team, which might be paid staff, but could be staff and volunteers together, and so that these conversations, so that the employee handbook is not just like between me as the rector and an individual staff member. It's played out in terms of how we share in ministry in the context of teams. And even something as simple as like when one of our staff members is taking a vacation, they're not just bringing that to me to sign off on. They're talking about it with their team, making sure workflow is covered, making sure that works for the others on their team, and then bring it. So just thinking about it from the perspective of teams versus individuals has been helpful to us. That's one thing.
Great. Stephen, you have any comments?
When I think part of the buy-in, not to be simplistic about it too much, but I hope that part of the buy-in too will be served by making sure that your manual and your policies are consistent with who your vestry and your parish have said they want to be. We for example made a decision at a previous parish where I worked to revise the policy to have paid paternity leave match the length of times paid maternity leave. That was after careful consideration from the community to say, we think this is consistent with our values of saying, like, equality of genders, right, was very important. And they thought this was a way of signaling that. So I don't think they would have had a hard time then having buy-in from people on the policy, because that was very much what they saw as consistent with that value. No, that's not to say that another parish may not look at it from a different perspective and say, our maternity leave is longer because a mother who's just had a baby and is recovering at home needs more time than a father does. That's not a bad value either. But then that parish hopefully is able to articulate why they've made a different decision than this one has. In developing the ability to articulate that, I think the buy-in should naturally come about as a result of that as well, because you've come by it naturally as a community. This is why we've set this policy.
Great. Thank you. Question on the chat, going back to the nuts and bolts. Should all staff, hourly and salaried, have vacation authorized? I would say yes, we do require that here. Otherwise, one, how you just determine between sick, vacation, or just goofing off. But John Crow or John Rohr, Steve, do you guys have any comments about that?
I just think everyone should have some kind of record. I mean, it depends on if you are in California, where I worked like for 20 years, or even Chicago, I believe, where you're required to pay out vacation if someone leaves, then you need an audit trail to say this person got approval to take it. So there's some very practical things like that. But then there's just it's a way of avoiding that conflict and saying, wait a minute, I thought I was going to be off next Sunday, and another clergy member going, oh no, I thought it was me, or some kind of, some example like that. It helps ensuring that you're well staffed and everything's covered.
And a follow-up they're asking is email okay for, I think they mean or a specific form. We use a specific form. We have a request for time off form, and that's for anything, funeral, sick. I mean, sick you do when you come back, but vacation, because you really should have a written notice out. I mean, email is okay if it's an emergency and they emailing you say, my father just died. I'm going to Ohio for his funeral or whatever. That's something that happens. But the normal day-to-day vacations or I'm having surgery, so I'm going to be out for a week, those need to be written and saved in their personnel file. Other thoughts on that? Or am I completely off my rocker, which is probably true too?
I'll push back a little bit there. I mean, again, it's the same in the size. I mean, if it's a real small group and it's time off, not leave. So I'm going to touch on that because you said someone's sick in the hospital. If it's just like I need next Wednesday off, okay, approved. You want to have that notice that it's been approved, so that's in the record. Just keep in mind if you need that documentation, or somebody wants a copy of the time that they were off, which most of the time you'd be obligated to provide, then you have to go back and print all those emails and find all of them and all that. Leave, when someone needs to take a medical leave or they're going to take an unpaid leave of absence, if they're taking a leave, especially if it falls under FMLA, there is a mandated form that has to be completed, medically certified, before that job protection is in place. You may not care about that job protection, but you do want to show that you're following the FMLA in case later on someone says you denied me my FMLA because you wouldn't let me take the 12 weeks off when I needed, surgery. My doctor was telling me I had to be off that long.
And John, the minimum for the requirement for FMLA is 50 or more employees. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And is that full and part-time, or is that full-time equivalents?
Believe it's full-time. I think it's full and part-time.
Okay.
It's people, I think it's counts on payroll. And there's all this other stuff about if within a 50-mile radius, if the same, and I don't think this would get into the diocese. That's an interesting question. But like, could it be considered that multiple churches would make that FMLA required? I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, I know from my experience, I've been in churches that St. David's obviously qualified. We have a lot of entities, a lot of employees, but I've been in churches where there's only a handful of employees, but we follow FMLA anyway, just to get all that in writing, just to make sure, because the forms that they fill out, their doctor has to fill out forms and send to you to file, and so it's so much easier, and you don't have to worry about somebody coming back at you for not doing it or to make sure you're doing it correctly. Folks, I'm so sorry. I knew this time was going to go fast, and it has gone very fast. I want to thank Stephen and John Crow. Thank you all so much for being on this webinar. We could do a 3-hour or half-day one. I know that somebody in the chat asked about where's the best place to get classes or things like HR. I put in the chat that your local community college, your local college university has continuing ed campuses, and also there's a great resource, SHRM, Society
for Human Resources Management.
Right, .org.
And
and they have workshops, and they have a lot of resources.
Yeah, for like $99, well, maybe $199, you can join and become a SHRM member. They have templates you can get,
Yep.
guidance. If this is a space you're going to wade into, I would recommend that expense because it will save you so much time.
I
You may
would
be
too.
able to pull something off and
Yep.
it'd be ready.
They have samples of everything, of anything you can imagine. So yes, do that. Thank you all so much. This will be available as a recording by probably tomorrow. Again, remember, EPN has brought you this. We also have a conference coming up the first week of March of next year in Charlotte, North Carolina, so you don't want to miss that. Again, thank you to our presenters. Thank you so much to EPN for hosting this. And you all have a great day, and good luck, and God bless all your ministries. Thank you very much.
God bless you, everyone.
Bye-bye.